Howdy, I'm Jammer. So, you'll note before I say anything else, I am wearing a Rick and Morty t shirt. Why am I wearing it? Well, just as I've mentioned from time to time, I'm pretty white. Like, I'm really white. So, naturally, I'm a white man on the internet. I like Rick and Morty, of course. I'm sounding a lot like my girlfriend right now. But the fact of the matter is, I really do love the TV show Rick and Morty. It's one of my favorite TV shows because, one, I like animated shows. It's just, I tend to prefer them over more traditional live action series. But one of the other things I really like about Rick and Morty is it's a good sci fi show and it makes me laugh. That's why when the Rickmobile came to Ground Zero Comics a couple years ago, I got in line, I bought myself this t shirt, I got a Funko Pop doll, which normally I don't care about those, but it was like Rick and the Mad Max car. I got a bird person action figure. I got a Morty towel. It was a fun day. And on the note of Rick and Morty, one of my favorite all times episodes is Raising Gazorpazorp. The general premise is that Rick and Morty were at a pawn shop somewhere in the galaxy, what have you, and Morty notices what basically amounts to a sex doll, and Rick buys it for him because why not? Well, what they ultimately discover is the sex doll is from an alien planet, and that alien planet is composed of a race of beings who have divided the genders. There are the males, who are just these intense warrior creatures, the most aggressive beings in the universe, and they just live on this kind of desert wasteland where they do nothing but fight and kill each other. And then occasionally these weird sex dolls come down from this gigantic floating sort of satellite thing, and they're trying to figure out what happens. Come to find out, all the female Gazorpazorps have basically created an intense colony, or created a sort of exterior colony from the men where they have culture and sophistication, and they listen to one another, and they compliment each other's tops. And after that, it's just this beautiful breakdown of like the battle of the sexes, what have you. It's an interesting concept, and one that I still really, really, really love, because even though I'm not a big fan of single sex environments that can be frat houses, especially, probably the most pernicious, in terms of creating a single sex atmosphere, I've never really liked it. I like talking with women, I like being around women, I always have. Part of the reason is because I'm attracted to them, but then also, too, just generally had more to talk to with women than I did with men. So, naturally, it led me to several books that kind of explore the topic. Now, the idea of a sort of woman only world is something that has been explored in the medium of comics before in Brian Vaughan's book, Why the Last Man. Now, I'm going to be real. I hate that book. And in fact, when we reviewed it at the graphic novel book club that I'm a part of, I may have ripped it to shreds, and there may now be a policy about yelling profanities because of me. So we're not going to probably ever talk about Why the Last Man on this channel, and if you got a problem with that, sorry, just I'm not going to do it. I don't like it. I love Saga, and I have every intention about talking about Saga at some point, because Brian K. Vaughan is a great writer. I just don't like the Why the Last Man. But I still liked the concept and the conceit of Why the Last Man, which is why when my library basically mentioned that there was still some money left in the budget for this fiscal year and that they needed to spend some on the graphic novel collection, I sat down and I made up a list, and one of them was a book that I've really been kind of dying to read, and that is Woman World by Aminder Dhaliwhal. Now, quick thing. Aminder Dhaliwhal, I can almost guarantee you I mispronounced their name, and if I did, I'm so sorry. I really am. Again, East Texas boy, speech impediment, just, I apologize. Now, if you haven't heard of Woman World, it's been making a lot of the rounds in terms of critical reception. It's put out by the company Drawn and Quartered. Well, you can't really see it because my library has covered all the sort of publication information with stickers, what have you. But it's coming from the publication Drawn and Quarterly. They're an independent press that tends to put out sort of smaller runs. Linda Berry, if you've ever heard of her, and I definitely would recommend her work because she's awesome, puts out several books through that company. And they've kind of started to create a kind of niche for themselves in terms of publishing comics that are not superhero oriented, but are not, how you say, soullessly and abysmally realistic. Drawn Quarterly's works can be weird and quirky, and Woman World, which we'll get into the content of it here in just a second, most definitely fits that description. So, moving forward, it's important to recognize this book is not going to be a kind of soul-crushing concept the way Why the Last Man was. Why the Last Man was largely designed to be a series to sort of explore kind of what The Walking Dead did, but in not as much of a fun or as interesting way, and that's a heavy compliment towards The Walking Dead coming from me. But whatever the case, this book is not going to be soul-crushing. In fact, it's cute and it's charming. And I need to just stop fluffing it up and just get into the content section of what is Woman World actually about. Okay, so now that we've had a little bit of introductions with it, what exactly is Woman World? Well, first off, Woman World is not necessarily a graphic novel. What it is it's kind of like a bound trade. But what's unique about Woman World is it originally began as a webcomic, specifically through the medium of Instagram. This book was largely a collection of individual gag comics that were published on Dhaliwhal's Instagram account. And then, due to the popularity and the success of the strip, Drawn Quarterly eventually decided to publish the book. This is honestly becoming more and more of kind of an established trend. You'll have books kind of like Ugloff, a book which I really want to talk to at some point. There's also Cyanide and Happiness, which you've probably seen either on YouTube or possibly on a friend's Facebook page. More and more web comics are coming out, establishing a market, and then eventually getting book deals. And honestly, this, I don't have time to talk about it long term. We'll talk about it a little bit more when we discuss the sort of form of comics in and of themselves. But what's important here is that this book is largely a collection of gags. Now, at the same time, there is a kind of overarching story to them. The book begins with a very simple concept. There were these things called men. That's a man and that's a man. However, there was a man by the name of Dr. Sharma who came to a very startling realization. He was studying genes and he came to the discovery of something's happening to men. And as these introductory pages are really good at showing, eventually basically what happens is men, for whatever reason, are steadily dying off. They don't offer really a reason for it. It's just for whatever reason, fewer and fewer men are being born. So as opposed to previous concepts where all the men are dramatically dying off, it's really just a situation of life is continuing, but for whatever reason, men are just not occurring when they're born. Instead, it's mostly just women being born. Until eventually, despite all the chaos and protests, despite all the politics, what have you, eventually there are simply no more men. Once upon a time, there were no men. Now, that sounds really gloomy. How could this book possibly be funny? Well, the book in question focuses on a small group of women, particularly a small village of women contained of a doctor, a grandmother who actually was still alive while men were alive, a young girl who has recently been born. Now, immediately the question is, how are women still producing? Well, it's called sperm banks, you know. There's some part of men that are still living on. Whatever the case, though, what immediately then follows are the comics themselves, which are sort of small, again, kind of gag comics, which give you little impressions of what is this world without men and how are these women coping. Well, as you can see from this little comic book here, I'll pause it. You can pause it for a second and read it. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so you can probably see from that comic alone the tone of the book. The first thought out of women's minds are, what are the heterosexual women going to do? Well, I mean, most of us are already bi anyway, right? Yes. Okay. All right. What's the next item up for, what's the next topic? Well, we have in the sort of next story, the grandmother and the little girl. Again, go ahead and pause it so you can read the comic. Okay. You've read it. The one example we have that men ever existed was an old, weathered copy of Paul Blart Mall Cop. All right. One last one here to sort of give you an example of it. Once they have established the fact that we're all just kind of going to be bi or asexual, and once we establish the fact that the only examples that we really have of men are crappy DVDs that somehow didn't get destroyed, we must now sort of rally around a particular image. So go ahead and pause it one more time. I'll let you read this one. You ready? Okay. So there again, you can see kind of the general tone from just these three comics alone. These are sort of small, short snippets in which these female characters are just sort of living their life and existing. And rather than sort of like fall into a heavy or depressed tone, really what we see here are just these women interacting with one another, doubting themselves. There's several instances in which you have sort of just a casual conversation between women that is something that would happen today. So really what's interesting about this book is it sets up a conceit that there is a world without men. And rather than kind of just allowing that to become a kind of depressing statement about, sort of a depressing statement about what is the future of humanity, instead, Dhaliwhal manages to just tell a lighthearted story of women kind of just being, addressing their insecurities, exploring their sexuality, trying to understand attraction, trying to understand what is their future. And then sometimes there are instances in which you get small little beautiful moments as well. Again, not every comic in this book is going to be a gag. Sometimes there are just small instances of, okay, we're sort of free of the influence of men or the specter of men. How exactly do we go about living our lives? You just live your life. I know there's probably going to be some guys out there that are going to get up in arms about the concept of this book and think that this is nothing more than like feminist propaganda, and it's not. It's a cute, fun comic book about a bunch of women living in a village where they make a flag out of Beyonce's thighs, and so they date each other, they have relationships, they break up, they try to just exist. And it was really fun just watching these women exist. Again, when we talk about comics, we have to remember, again, that it's still a very relatively new medium in terms of what most people would recognize as comics. It's a 20th century invention, and for the most part, it's predominantly been men making comics. So having a book, having a comic by a woman that's nothing but women and exploring the lives and moods and thoughts and opinions and experiences of women, this book is great. Add to the fact that you also have a diverse group of women. You have, again, Black women, Latinx women, Asian women, Native American women, what have you. You have a group of women, period. And so in this way, content-wise, Woman World is really interesting. I'm not going to say it's going to break new grounds, because there have been women cartoonists in the past. But this book does at least do a really good job of saying, hey, we've had some great women cartoonists beforehand. Let's just push it forward and just play with the concept. Woman World is fun. It's a fun book in terms of its content. And now, at the same time, I think it's also really interesting to discuss the form of this book and why I think you should really take your time and read it. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know. Look, I don't care what a bunch of, like, incel losers are going to say about me on YouTube, okay? We'll continue this conversation later. All right, so I've talked now about what is Woman World about. It's about a group of women living their lives in a post-men world. Now, formally, it's important to talk about Woman World as a graphic novel because of the concept that I explored at the start of the previous section. Again, we're not talking about a more sort of traditional graphic novel that we've experienced here on the channel. Most graphic novels are either single independent stories or else they are a collection of trades. Individual comic books that are then gathered together to create some kind of story. I believe... Oh. Book that I hope to cover in a later video, say Faith from the Valiant Universe. This book is a bound trade. You have independent issues of Faith number 1 through Faith number 4. So in this instance, we have an understanding that this is a story arc. With Woman World, however, we have a different experience because this is a web comic that has been sort of gathered together and then published as a story. There is some sort of general arc as we begin to observe the characters and we observe previous interactions between the characters. So we have a sense that this is a story that has been steadily growing over time. But at the same time, you don't have to read every single comic in this book in order to understand really what's happening. And that's kind of interesting to me in terms of the arrangement of just the book format of comics. Web comics are the future. As much as I love physical comics, the fact of the matter is, as we are pushing more and more into a digital landscape, we have to acknowledge that comics are going to adapt accordingly. Scott McCloud, in his book, Reinventing Comics, explores this to an incredible amount of depth. Now, that book, honestly, I'm not a big fan of because it's so dense. But it's still an interesting book for anybody who's interested in the future and just the general sort of genre, the medium of comics, period. Woman World is interesting because it's another example of publishers looking to the possibilities of the digital comics, of the digital landscape, and seeing potential markets. There are some people who are just going to go to Instagram and read Woman World. But then there's going to be some people, like yours truly, who want a bound trade because they love this world, they love this character, and they think it's a great comic. Now, in terms of the actual comic, comic itself, it should be noted there isn't that much play overall. For the most part, Dhaliwhal tends to exist primarily in either just sort of arrangements of square panels and sometimes throwing in a rectangular panel. Still, I think it would be a mistake to suggest that there's no artistry in this book whatsoever. You'll note here that this comic book tends to be dark along the edges of the outline. That's because, for the most part, these stories tend to deal with the kind of emotional disturbance or turbulence taking place in the character's life, or else sometimes they just happen to be taking place at night. Whereas these comics here, which tend to take place during the day and also tend to be a little bit more lighthearted, you'll note she doesn't outline the panels using darks or gray. It's a subtle mechanism, but it's really important to remember how important color can be, especially when you take into consideration that Woman World is predominantly black and white. There are some beautiful beautiful panels and pages at the start of this book. We have to understand that that's predominantly sort of after the fact. The original comics would have just been, for the most part, 5 to 6, maybe 8 panels, single pages, that are usually designed to deliver a gag. This isn't a weakness. Gag comics sometimes get a really bad rap because, for the most part, gag comics are like newspaper comics, which have not always been interested in exploring artistry or exploring the possibilities of the medium. Gag comics are designed, usually most of the time, to have talking heads that are kind of iconic or recognizable. They deliver a joke, you move on to the crossword puzzle, or your horoscope if you're into that. Woman World is different because, again, because it's a web comic, we have to understand it's designed kind of akin to a newspaper in some sense, to just be ingested and then you keep scrolling by. I'm not talking down on that. Again, gag comics are evolving, and they're evolving with the digital landscape. And so in this way, what's important here is not so much always the form that's taking place in this collection, but the very concept of this collection, period. Again, I'm going to talk hopefully more about digital comics more in the future. I've got some Ogloff books, and I've got some Cyanide and Happiness books as well that I would really love to talk to on this channel. But I wanted to talk about Woman World first because it's a really sweet and fun book. And even though, for the most part, you have a book which is very, very simple and iconic in terms of its construction and presentation, it has a tremendous amount of heart. And Dhaliwhal is really good at allowing the medium, the arrangement of the panels, and then just the general structure of the book itself to kind of just let the reader feel for a moment. And so in this way, even though there's not a lot of experimentation in terms of a lot of the comics, I still feel that there's something really interesting taking place in this book formally, and I definitely think it's worth your time. So with that in play, let's do the final hurrah and call it a day. You're not even gonna listen to me at all. You're just gonna stand there, getting the silent treatment from Athena. Oh well, what can you do? So, Woman World. What do we think? It's cute, and it's sweet, it's adorable. It really explores a concept in a way that, to me, is far more emotionally satisfying than other books which have tried to explore similar topics in the past. And it's a funny book that manages to take something that is, again, from a digital landscape and convert it into a solid printed book. That can be a challenge because there are some things that are funny on the internet, but not necessarily funny when you've got it as a physical bound book. Now, again, I borrowed this from the library, but I have every intention of tracking down a copy of this in my local comic book shop and picking it up. And I would expect the same from you, too, because hopefully, if you're this far on the video, you're curious. I've piqued your curiosity, I hope. Now, final summation of this book is I don't believe this is going to be anything like Fun Home or Watchmen or Mouse. But at the same time, it's not trying to be. Like I said, this is a collection, for the most part, of gag comics. It's designed to make you laugh. It's designed to make you smile. It's something fun to read. And one of the joys of comics is not every experience has to be an intense amount of introspection. Sometimes a book can make you think for a moment, but then also make you laugh and smile. And so in this way, I definitely think Woman World achieved something really interesting from an aesthetic perspective. And then as well, as an unapologetic feminist and just as an unapologetic fan of women who make comics, Woman World is a blast. It's a chance to just see a group of women interacting with one another in the realm of comics and just being and living their lives and being ridiculous and serious and funny. And it's just a wonderful book that will make you smile. I don't know what else to offer to you. If that doesn't sound interesting at all to you, I'm sorry. That's all I got. Read Woman World. It's great. All right. I think I'm going to go ahead and call it a day there. Thank you so much for watching. I tremendously appreciate it. As always, please like, share, and subscribe, all that jazz. It helps me know that you're liking these videos and that you want to see more, or at the very least, it gives me positive affirmation so that I can wake up and get out of bed in the morning instead of just lying there wondering why I didn't just marry Chad. Sorry, I went somewhere sad. In terms of Woman World, your local comic book shop might have a copy of it. I would definitely recommend that you check them out because Drawn and Quarterly is, even though they tend to be an independent press, they are gaining more and more traction in terms of the general public. More and more of their books are winding up on book lists on websites like NPR and Bloomberg, what have you. If your local comic book shop doesn't have the book, check out your local public library. I mean, again, I borrowed this one from my library. Yours can probably have it, or if they don't, they probably can get it to you through an interlibrary loan. So check it out. It's worth your time. And again, thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. Go read some comics.